Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's final session of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowed Symposia in Jewish Studies. My name is Lee Rothbard, Program Director of the Symposia, assisted by Professor Emeritus Richard Hecht, who was Director for over 25 years, and also our student assistant, Noah Weiss. Noah is graduating at the end of this academic year, and so this will unfortunately be his last Taubman Symposium session with us. Richard and I take a moment to thank Noah profusely for his steadfast help in a wide variety of tasks. His very able assistance will be sorely missed. All of us wish him the best in future pursuits. This year's past symposia have dealt with a variety of topics: Jewish-Christian dialogue in border zones, the Zionist movement and photographic archives, the late stage of iconic singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen's life, Omar Bartov's new fact/fiction novel, The Butterfly and the Axe, on the Holocaust fate of his family. Further, symposia dealt with the ongoing political fallout and human tragedy of the Israel-Palestine war. And most recently, the symposium dealt with the history and influence of Jews of Latin America. Today's session deals with Jewish humorist, movie director, and songwriter Mel Brooks, none other than. Our guest speaker is Jeremy Dauber of Columbia University, where he is Atran Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture in the Department of Germanic Languages, as well as Director of Columbia's Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies. He has also held visiting posts at UCLA, Harvard, and Oxford universities. Jeremy's research interests include Yiddish literature, comparative Jewish literature, the Yiddish theater, American Jewish literature, and popular culture. Jeremy is hugely prolific. He has published in the last 20 years 8 books. 8 books. If you calculate that out, that's 2 books every 5 years. Amazing. Including 2, in particular, Jewish comedy and The Worlds of Shalom Aleichem, both of which were finalists for the National Jewish Book Award. And then most recently, The American Scary, The History of American Horror of 2024. So just recently, I remember when you told me, Jeremy, it was about to come out. The book he's talking about today is provocatively titled Mel Brooks, Disobedient Jew, Yale University Press 2023, all the way back in 2023. I'll invite Jeremy to begin in a moment, but let me remind everyone that there is a question and answer area. Don't wait until the end to formulate your questions. Just go ahead and type them into the question and answer box, and we'll get to them at the end, and Jeremy will answer. So now I'd like to turn over the proceedings to Professor Jeremy Dauber on The Disobedient Jew, Mel Brooks.
Lee, thank you very much for that really warm introduction. It's a real pleasure after these months of correspondence to get a chance to meet you in so to speak person at last. Richard, Noah, it's a pleasure to have gotten a chance to talk to you, both of you as well. And thank you to the Taubman family for spreading Jewish education sort of more broadly to the community of Santa Barbara. And, now thanks to the magic of the internet, kind of even broader than that. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to get a chance to talk to you about this figure, this treasure that I love so much, Mel Brooks. As Lee said, this is part of a biography series from Yale University Press called Jewish Lives, in which one produces various Jewish biographies of different subjects. And as you can imagine, for Mel Brooks, this was not a heavy lift to try and argue for the Jewishness of Mel Brooks. None of you were surprised when you would see that connection, obviously. But what was interesting to me to think about, and some of this was alluded to in the title or the subtitle of the book, Mel Brooks' Disobedient Jew, what kind of Jewishness was Mel Brooks sort of representing? And over the course of the book, I really try and make the argument that in some ways, Brooks really is a kind of archetypal American Jew. He's someone who really is a central symbol of the kind of mixed love for America, besotting, overwhelming love for the possibilities that America offers, and also the kind of a little bit of alienation that makes Jews stand apart from whatever it is to be fully, wholly, coherently American, and how Brooks expresses that. Most prominently, of course, in comedy, but even really specifically in parody, in a kind of comic form, which both relies on really, really loving American culture. In order to parody something, you have to watch it hundreds and thousands of times, right? You really have to be sort of very familiar with all its beats, but also you have to be a little bit alienated from it. You have to be able to stand aside and say, you know what? I see this and I see it and I love it, but I also see that it's not really complete. It has certain faults, it has certain absences that I can kind of make fun of. And those are in some sense symbolic or metaphorical for the absence of Jews in a certain way, sort of at least fully into that picture. So that in some sense is the argument. And it was exemplified for me in this phrase, disobedient Jew, because the way in which Mel Brooks used to sign his letters to all sorts of people in correspondence would be your obedient Jew, Mel Brooks, right? Which is a takeoff on this very old fashioned, your obedient servant, whatever. Now, Brooks, of course, never was obedient. You don't think of Mel Brooks as being a kind of obedient guy. But on the other hand, here was someone who very much wanted to be part of the big system. And in the talk that I'm going to give to you guys, which in some ways encapsulates maybe the first lesser well-known part of Brooks's biography before he really becomes Mel Brooks. So I think maybe you're going to be able to see some of that complicated dynamic in his own life. So in the talk that I'm going to give you for the next, let's say, half an hour or so, I'm only going to take you part of the way through Brooks's life. I'm going to get you maybe to the end of the beginning or the beginning of a next chapter. And of course, if you want to know more about what happens, and if you want to know more details about some of that story, well, there's a book I wrote that you're welcome to buy. And we're going to try and I think Lee's going to try and put the link to purchase it in the chat or in the Q&A or something like that, so that you will be able to do that. So I'm just going to give you the first part. And we're going to talk about that, and then we'll open it up for all sorts of questions, and we can talk about whatever anybody wants to. All right. So let us move backwards from 2024 to 1926, from Santa Barbara or the internet or virtual space into Brooklyn, into Brownsville in Brooklyn, and into the onto, I should say, the Kaminsky kitchen table, which is where young Melvin Kaminsky comes into the world, right? It was a home birth, and it was a birth to the family, the Kaminsky family, of two immigrants, right? These are two immigrants. Kate Brookman, Mel's mother, was born in Kiev, in the Ukraine, right? And Max Kaminsky, his father, emigrated from Danzig when he was a boy, and they met in Brooklyn. Okay, so the two of them, and Brooks was the youngest of four boys: Irving, Lenny, Bernie, and Melvin, right? Which sounds kind of like the Marx Brothers in some ways, but that was what they were, the four boys. And things went quite swimmingly for them in the first 2 years of young Mel's life, but then tragedy struck. And I've written, as Lee alluded to, a biography of Shalom Aleichem as well. I've written a history of Jewish comedy. And one of the things you very frequently find about comedians of all sorts, and Jewish comedians no less than others, is that very frequently they have some kind of tragedy in their own personal lives, some kind of familial tragedy at an early age. Shalom Aleichem, for example, lost his mother before he was a bar mitzvah boy. And Mel Brooks lost his father at the age of 2, right? When he was 2 years old, his father died. He was 34 years old. His father dies of tuberculosis. And you can say in certain ways that Brooks was always, for the rest of his life, kind of hungering for a kind of male authority figure, for a kind of patriarchal authority. And in more than that, he was hungering for a certain kind of love that was absent in his life in that particular way, that an audience would fill, right? And we'll get back to that over and over again. That's not to say that he did not have familial love in his own life. He said in his own very, very colorful way, he says, I was adored, right? This is Mel's a quote from Brooks. I was always in the air, hurled up, kissed, thrown in the air again. Until I was 6, my feet didn't touch the ground. Right. That's so he did have a lot of affection in his life, but he had this absence as well. And that absence was compounded in a certain kind of way because his older siblings and his mother, of course, had to go to work to support the family. The father had passed on. And so Brooks, the youngest of the family, was a little bit what we would call sort of in a more recent time, a kind of latchkey kid, right? He had to take care of himself. And he really found two different kinds of venues that are important for our story to do that. The first of those was the street, right, or the street corner. And Brooks, these were the streets of Brooklyn. They were very, at this point, the very Jewish streets. They were filled with kind of Yiddish. They were filled with Jewish aspirational intellectual culture. They were filled with music, all sorts of Jews learning instruments and thinking maybe that was a path. And they were also filled with words. And Brooks, being a kind of short little, not particularly strong kid, learned that the way that he would get into trouble, I suppose, and also get out of trouble was by using his words, right? And so he developed that art of the spritz, as you can call it, the kind of street corner, quick gab, quick talk that would obviously be so important to his sensibility later on. Nobody ever accused Mel Brooks of being reticent. Quite the contrary. One of the things, that he is sort of known for, is this just kind of verbal genius, this verbal pyrotechnic genius, and a lot of that comes back to that street corner. So that was one venue that he found that kind of took him in, so to speak, and took care of him. The second was, and this will not surprise any of you either, I suspect, the movie theater. Right. Movie theaters were at that point really coming into their own. Right. It's almost, I mean, we know that Brooks was born in 1926, but just to remind you about what that means, he really comes of age with the sound film in the movies, right? The sound film is basically coterminous with his early childhood. And so all of these great iconic genres really in some ways become what we think of them now with Brooks. Right, he sees one of Alfred Hitchcock's earliest movies, The Lodger, at 6. At 8, he sees Frankenstein. He must have seen it on a re-release. It comes out a little earlier than that, but he says he saw it at 8, and he had these nightmares about Frankenstein, he says, where he dreamed that Frankenstein would come up his fire escape and would kind of attack him. And the way that he dealt with this was very interesting, right? Where what he said was he became unfrightened of it by imagining this Frankenstein figure wearing top hat and tails and dancing to Putting on the Ritz, the popular song of the time. And of course, unlike most of us who have various ways of dealing with our childhood fears, he then, 40 years later, would turn that into an actual filmed routine in Young Frankenstein, right? But these things really were part of his childhood. He would go to the movies. He would be there for hours. He would watch everything that was going on. He was a child of the movies, right? But that said, the movies were new. They were a new art form in a lot of ways, and they were not necessarily as prestigious in art form. If you wanted to be a success in entertainment, right? If you want to dream of sort of the most elegant, gallant form of entertainment, they're the new kid on the block, so to speak. The older thing was across the river, right? Across the East River, and it was Broadway. It was the theater. It was the Great White Way, right? This was the dream, was to be a man of the theater. And Brooks talks about a very, very kind of crucial moment in his formation where his uncle took him to see the original production of Anything Goes, right? That Cole Porter musical, Anything Goes, and to see Ethel Merman in it. Now, Ethel Merman also has that same kind of outer borough moxie, right? But she's not Jewish, but she has that same kind of loud kind of, and hey, anything goes, right? Anything goes. And this was something that really Brooks took to heart, that there was a way of kind of making it in. Now, Broadway was also quite Jewish even at the time, but nonetheless, there was this sense of something that you could aspire to. And I think that so much of Brooks's career, even though we know him, as Lee introduced quite correctly, as this major iconic figure of the movies, we see how the theater really, really is undergirds everything, right? And we'll get back to that again and again, but that helps us understand Brooks if you think of him as a theater guy who was in the movies rather than just a movie guy. Okay, so these are the young Brooks, and he actually, he begins to become interested in entertainment, and as a profession, and as I alluded to before, one of the paths was through music, and he begins to take drum lessons because that is, sort of a natural sort of comedian's instrument, right? Right. We all know that kind of rhythm, right? And just to show you the sense of what a small world this was and how much of the great and good of American popular culture comes out of these sort of small things. The person who he takes drum lessons from, at least very briefly, is Buddy Rich, who was a drummer. Probably many of you on this call know who this was, a drummer for Artie Shaw's big band. Now, the way Brooks tells the story, later on, when he becomes famous, he runs into Artie Shaw, excuse me, not Artie Shaw, Buddy Rich, many years later. And he tells him that, I'm sure you don't remember me, but I was like little Mel Kaminsky. I took lessons from you. And the way Brooks tells the story, Buddy Rich bursts into tears, right? You have to allow for a certain Brooksian exaggeration in this story, but let's tell it the way Brooks does. Bursts into tears. And, Brooks says, what's the matter? And, as he says, through Rich's tears, he said, why did you give it up? Why did you become a movie person? You could have been such a great drummer. Again, not sure if that's true or not, right? But it's too good, as they say in the sort of journalism business, it's too good a story to check. But what is also important about Brooks's musical interlude are, again, two things. The first of them is nomenclatural, right? It's around at this time when he starts taking these drum lessons as a teenager where he begins to change his name. Something that so many people do. He changes his name from Melvin Kaminsky to Mel Brooks, named after his mother's maiden name, Brookman, and claims that the reason he changes his name is because Kaminsky would have been too big to fit on the big drum, on the big bass drum, right? Again, we know all sorts of motivations for American Jewish entertainers changing their names, but certainly that is part of it, and it was tied up with his musical interest. The second, not nomenclatural, but career-wise, professional, he then begins to move as a teenager to help support his family in the summers to the mountains, right? And so, many of you, all of you, I suspect on this call, know the importance of the Borscht Belt, of the Catskills, to the development of not just American Jewish comedy and American Jewish entertainment, but American entertainment and comedy, full stop, right? And the way I always think about it and the way I always talk about it is that the Borscht Belt is born of anti-Semitism and air conditioning. Okay, so the air conditioning, there really wasn't much of it, right, in these pre-war days, right, in New York City. Actually, one of the few exceptions is the movie theaters. But in your average house, your average apartment, you don't have air conditioning. The summer in the city is sweltering, right? You need to get out. And you would go to the mountains, you would go north, and you would go to hotels in the mountains. Now, there were plenty of hotels already in the mountains, but they didn't accept Jews, right? They were restricted. And so as a result, the Jews built their own, right? And they built the Borscht Belt, or sometimes it was called the Sour Cream Sierras. And what they did was you had all of these, Jewish clientele. They would come up as a family. Often the breadwinner would work, the man would work down in the city during the week and come up on the weekends. The family would stay there the whole summer. And you had these people who were, depending on your income level, right? They were starving, and they were starving for these voluminous amounts of food that were sort of provided and prepared. And they were also starving for entertainment, right? And so, they wanted, and they were very demanding, right? And so they would not just settle for the same act over and over again, right? So you had these amazing amounts of entertainers and entertainment that were just being shoved into the maw of the Borscht Belt, if I can put it that way. And of course, 85%, 90% of these people we never heard from again. But there is a group that the remaining 10% become essentially the backbone of American comedy and popular culture in certain ways in the next quarter century, the next 30 years. Brooks himself, when he goes up to the mountains, is, a young kid, and he starts out small. According to his memoir, he starts out, and I have no reason to doubt this, literally operating a sour cream station, okay, in the very beginning. But he very quickly graduates to being a tumbler. And a tumbler, for those of you who don't know, the perfect definition, of course, supplied by Mel Brooks, who says it's a busboy with tinsel in his blood, right? That's the definition that Brooks has of it. Someone who's out there, who's around to kind of just make everything kind of a little bit sort of more magical, a little bit more fun, a little bit more funny, a little more peppy. And Brooks was a junior pool tumbler. Okay, that was his job. He was at the pool. And one of his shticks was that he would dress up in a big, heavy wool business suit. And he would take 2 suitcases that were filled with rocks, and he would stand up. He's 14 years old. He would stand up, walk on the diving board, right over to the edge of the diving board in the suit with the briefcases. He would say, "Business is terrible. I can't go on." Right, and he would jump off the diving board into the pool. Right. This was funnier, I think, because Mel Brooks didn't know how to swim. And so he had to be sort of fished out after every performance, which again is sort of a sign that he was a kind of guy who was committed to dangerous comedy, right? To pushing the edge, right? But he was a small fry in the mountains, right? At that point, and we're talking about 1940, 1941, right? Before Pearl Harbor, the person who is unquestionably the king entertainer of the mountains is Sid Caesar, right? Caesar was playing at the Avon. Caesar, whose name somewhat unbelievably was not changed. He was born Sid Caesar, and whose talents were just so amazing. Right? This tall, handsome, muscular guy with the verbal gifts of the gods, right? His father had owned a diner in Queens. Queens was, as it is now, but it was an extremely ethnically diverse place. People would come to the diner and they would talk in whatever languages they spoke. And Caesar, whose incredibly gifted ear, would pick up those different locutions, and he would then sort of regurgitate them in a kind of double talk that he would become famous for, that would be so convincing that for a while people who spoke those languages would sort of wonder why they weren't understanding what it was that young Sid was saying to them, until they realized that he was, just joking around. Suffice it to say that at the Avon, one of his great bits that kind of killed was a very long argument delivered entirely in this kind of double talk between Donald Duck and Adolf Hitler, right? And of course, both of these were these double talk, and this would sort of knock people dead in the aisles, so to speak. And Brooks was just had found in some ways his first great authority figure. Remember, we talked about that absence. We talked about how he was looking for people. Here was someone who he was worshiping, and Caesar was willing to be worshipped, right? And they didn't really know each other that well then, but that was where apparently they made their acquaintance. And then the war broke out. Now, as I had suggested to you, Brooks was always a little late, right? And in some ways that clearly worked to his advantage. His older brothers were old enough that they had to go to work to help support the family. As the youngest of the family, he was not. He didn't have to do that. And he was young enough that when Pearl Harbor happened and when America went into the war, he was too young to enlist. He was certainly patriotic. He wanted to, but it was his older siblings who did, and he didn't until very late in the war. But he did, and I think that that's always very important. I tell my students, we always have a lot of talk about, who is licensed to talk about fighting Nazis, how you fight Nazis, how you do all these kind of things, right? And one of the things to remember about Mel Brooks is that he actually literally fought Nazis, right? He went to the European theater of operations. He was a forward observer for the artillery in Germany before VE Day, right? After VE Day, he switched to a kind of military Tumblr role for something kind of like the USO. But for the time being, he was actually fighting Nazis. One of his older brothers was shot down and was a prisoner of war through the war. Thankfully, he survived by not telling everybody, his captors that he was Jewish, just that he was American. So Brooks had a lot of reasons, right? Even more than sort of your average Jew who had a lot of reasons to hate Nazis. And it's not surprising that Brooks, from his own sensibility, had already developed something which would become a touchstone of his comic philosophy, that the way that you can fight, of course you can fight with bullets and you have to sometimes, and you fight with artillery, but the way that he can fight, the way that he can make a difference, as opposed to the entire United States Army, right, is through comedy. And it's not coincidental that our first pictures of Mel Brooks in a professional capacity appear in the military magazine Stars and Stripes, and they appear of young Mel Brooks, right? He's still a teenager at this point. Young Mel Brooks pretending to be Adolf Hitler, okay? Doing an act in which he pretends to be Adolf Hitler in order to make fun of him, to knock him down a peg, to reduce him to size. And that kind of comic minimization of the bad guys, of Nazis particularly, that would be, as all of you who've seen The Producers know, that would be sort of a touchstone of Brooks's approach, sort of going forward, right? So here, in some ways, is really where Brooks develops that kind of ethos that will serve him well comedically for the rest of his career in a lot of ways. So the war ends, and Brooks stays in Europe for a little bit of time. He's still in the military. Eventually, he's demobilized. He goes back, and he really doesn't quite find the success that he hopes for sort of right away. Right? He just doesn't. One of my favorite stories from this period, which kind of gets to the depths of this and is useful because it'll come back in a little bit, is that he goes to see one of the great producers of the Broadway producers of the era, right? You hear that word producers, right? The great producers, a guy named Kermit Bloomgarden, okay? And he's a little, he's a young guy, and he says, there's no way that Bloomgarden is going to see this picture, right? And he says to the secretary, tell Mr. Bloomgarden that Paul Muni is here to see him, okay? Paul Muni is probably, some of you on this call know, if not all of you, Muni, one of the great film actors of that generation, right? Okay. And so, of course, Bloomgarden comes right out to see, young Mel Brooks, who is definitely not Paul Muni. And he says, hey, you're not Paul Muni. And Brooks says, no, but here's the thing. Paul Muni changed his name. I'm the real Paul Muni. Now, the funny thing about this, of course, is that Paul Muni had changed his name under the name of his birth name of Muni Weisenfreund. He had been an actor in the Yiddish theater before he became Paul Muni, right? So that was true. But of course, so had Mel Brooks, right? He had changed his name too. Everybody has all of these different sort of name-changing things that are going around. Bloomgarden, I think, gets the joke on all sorts of levels, savors it, says something like, kid, I like your moxie. You're going to do great things. I don't have anything for you right now. But Bloomgarden will come back to in our story later, and will play an important role, and so that's why I'm bringing this up too. Meanwhile, Brooks does have a more successful association that he kind of renews rather than makes, and that's with Sid Caesar. Caesar, from an entertainment perspective, had a very good war. He had toured widely. He had been in movies based on the kind of variety tours that he did. He was back in the nightclubs in New York. He was wowing them, and he was working with a person he had worked with in the mountains, and then in the during the war, a guy named Max Liebman. Now Liebman is a major figure, although unsung generally, in the history of sort of American post-war culture, and certainly post-war Jewish culture. As I say, Liebman used to run the shows, the weekly reviews at the Tamiment, which was the sort of creme de la creme of the entertainment. It would be sort of a new Broadway caliber musical every week, for those very demanding guests, right? And so when there is this new medium that is developing in the late 1940s called television, right, which at this point is a very kind of New York oriented institution. All of these executives, these network executives of these new television networks say, we need somebody who has experience putting on live material, right? Because television is live then, obviously. It needs to be done sort of a mass amount, new material every week. They need to have networks of talent that are sort of New York or New York adjacent. And so they call on Liebman, and Liebman, of course, brings Caesar along. And Caesar wants to bring his little friend who he's reacquainted with, Mel Brooks, along. And Liebman says, no, like there's no way. Because Liebman is a good producer. Liebman understands that you need to make the trains run on time. That's a producer's job. And he understands that Brooks, even if he has some talent, is a chaos agent, right? And so he doesn't want anything to do with Brooks. But Caesar, either just because he likes being worshipped, but I think even more than that, I think he sees that Brooks has a certain kind of comic, chaotic genius that he doesn't necessarily have. He has his own huge genius, but that he doesn't have, wants to keep him around. And so for a while, he pays him out of his own pocket. Caesar has a first show called the Admiral Broadway Review, which is actually canceled because it is too successful. If you want to know what that means, we can talk about it either in the Q&A or you can read the story in the book. That doesn't work out, though, pretty quickly. And then, of course, nobody is going to let him hang if his show is canceled for being too successful. And then NBC comes calling with your show of shows. And that, of course, becomes iconic and historical, right? Okay, so that is, where the story really begins to take off. And over the years, working for Caesar, as all of you know, Brooks begins to sort of move higher and higher. Now, I want in terms of the story of your show of shows, I really want to focus on two other figures that Mel Brooks comes in contact with. We talked about his relationship with Caesar, but now two other people, and that I think again are key to this DNA of what Mel Brooks is and what he becomes. One of them is very well known, one of them is not. I'll focus first on the one that's not as well known, a member of that fearsome writer's room, right, named Big Mel, or that was what he was called. Mel Brooks was Little Mel, right? He was a junior tyro kind of in this. Mel Tolkien was the Big Mel in the room, and he was a more sort of senior writer. And what he did for Brooks was he introduced him to the idea of a kind of aesthetic intellectual ambition. You sometimes, one of my takes in the book and just in general, which is sort of to the extent that I have a hot take or a counterproductive take, is that everyone calls Woody Allen an intellectual, but he is actually a pseudo-intellectual. That's what he always says, and I think he's right. And everyone always calls Mel Brooks not an intellectual at all, but he actually is an intellectual. And one of the reasons that he is because he has these ambitions of trying to have a kind of literary reach in some of his material, not all of it, of course, but some of it that comes from this Big Mel who introduces him to Moliere and to Dostoevsky and to Aristophanes and says to him, this is what really comedy should be. And so Brooks really begins to have these ambitions of really doing something great. And one of the things that we don't often think about from your show of shows is that it was made, its glory years were made in a time when not many people had televisions. The people who did have televisions were disproportionately urban, cosmopolitan, and sometimes we anti-Semites now use those as synonyms for Jewish, and that's not great. But let's be honest, the communities that were watching your show of shows were much more Jewish than America was at that particular point. Big Mel would sometimes say to the writer's room, guys, we've got to get going. It's Tuesday, and Jews all over the country are waiting to see what we're going to do on Saturday night, right? So you have this this kind of sense that they're able to do things that would have been really a little bit highbrow for an audience, maybe even 15 or 20 years later, who was watching television. So just to take one example, one of the great, all-time great skits of your show of shows is a 7-minute parody of the Italian neorealist classic, The Bicycle Thief. Now, you didn't have to have watched The Bicycle Thief in order to appreciate what's going on here, but when you hear it that way, you're like, wait a minute, these guys were all watching sort of these very sort of cutting edge art cinema classics. And they were like, we want to sort of do some version of that, right? So that's that big Mel influence that really does come down to Little Mel. So that's person one. Person two, I think, is obviously far more famous to all of us, and in some ways takes us to the next part of our story. And in some ways, the last part of the part of the story that I'm going to tell before we open it up to questions, the part where Mel Brooks again becomes Mel Brooks. So that person is, of course, Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks's long-term friend, the only relationship that matters to him as much as his second wife, Anne Bancroft's. And or almost as much, and you have just this incredible dynamic that goes on there. Now, at this point, of course, Reiner incalculably more influential, more famous than Brooks was. Reiner was on screen, right? He was constantly well known, but he and Brooks really kind of had a real partnership. And the most famous form of that partnership, of course, at least professionally, comes in the writer's room of your show of shows. Now, what happens is that, not surprisingly, in writers' rooms, you do all kinds of things, all kinds of comic moments that you could never do on television, particularly at the television of the time, right? You just play around and stuff like that. And at one point, according to his own memoir, Reiner is watching a television show, a different television show of the time called You Are There. And the idea was that, a 1950s reporter, would kind of go to historical scenes and would interview kind of, stakeholders there, right? You are at Yorktown. And so, here's the reporter going to interview Cornwallis or what have you, right? So one day, Reiner comes into the writer's room and does a version of this that you could never do on screen at that point, right? He goes over to Mel Brooks, sticks a pretend microphone in his face and says, "Sir, I understand you were alive at the time of Jesus Christ." Right? And without missing a beat, Mel Brooks goes in a Yiddish accent where he goes, "Oh boy," right? An old Jewish man. And thus the 2,000-year-old man begins, right? Now, of course, this does not, this Jesus thing could not possibly play, but no version of the 2,000-year-old man appears until about 10 years later when it's released on record. It appears to the public, I should say, until it is released on record in 1960. So what's the reason for that delay? Okay. And I think there are two really important reasons, and they both speak to our broader questions. The first of them is that, and Reiner talks about this in his memoir, he says, look, this was right after the Holocaust, and a lot of us were thinking about the ways in which anti-Semitism worked in the United States and elsewhere. And what we felt, he and Brooks, was that there was a way in which this was a kind of ethnic dialect comedy. It was a very standard part of American popular culture, right? Making fun of stereotypes based in no small part on their dialect and what have you. And he and they and some others really felt, well, maybe this was, to use a locution we don't know, bad for the Jews. Maybe this kind of dialect comedy, right? Maybe this was not so great, and maybe we shouldn't let this play kind of more broadly, right? And so they kind of kept it for show business parties and for friends and things like that. The other reason, the second reason, was similar but not exactly the same, feeling that this comedy was too insular, was too Jewish, was too show busy, was all of these things, right? It would not play. Forget about the fact of whether it would be anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic, right? It just wouldn't work. People wouldn't find it funny. And in many ways, and I talk about this in this other book, This History of Jewish Comedy, the 1950s is really a story of American society accepting Jewish humor as American humor. You don't have, it's not even Sid Caesar and Milton Berle, right? But all these Borscht Belt people coming on all these variety shows, having more and more Jewishness. And then you have people like Alan Sherman and Mickey Katz and so many other kinds of people who are coming, that by the time you get to the end of the decade, there is just a much more, Nichols and May, so many others, it's just a much more congenial set of circumstances for this kind of comedy. And the way in which this is proven the best, there are all sorts of stories about what finally convinced Reiner and Brooks to make this out public. But I will tell you my favorite one. I talk about a couple of others in the book, but I'll tell you my favorite one right now. And that is a story of one particular show business party, right? That they're at, and they're doing this routine. And I should say that over the course of the intervening decade, Reiner had taken to kind of carrying around a reel-to-reel recorder, recording some of these things, and they had made some private pressings of records in order to play for friends, and they have the kind of friends that you might imagine Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks to have, and one of those friends is Cary Grant, right? And so Cary Grant comes up to them at the party and he says, I'm not going to try and imitate Cary Grant, right? I think I have a friend who I think would enjoy this material that you do. Can I borrow one of your records and play it for her? And they say, sure, Cary, absolutely, do whatever you want, and they give him a record, and he comes back to them a few weeks later, maybe at another party or something like that, and he says, I played it for my friend. She listened to it. She thought it was wonderful. She loved it. And they said, oh, well, who was your friend? That's great to hear. And because Cary Grant has the kind of friends that he has, he says, well, it was the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. And the fact is that I think they figured if it was good enough for Queen Elizabeth, who, let's be honest, is probably the most Gentile person ever, right? Then, it probably is good enough for, general audiences. And so they release it. They release it actually, on a small label, a Capitol, which at that point was known really as a kind of hip jazz label, right? Mostly. It sells so well, they have to kind of it sells 1 million copies, just much more than anyone had dreamed. But at that point, obviously, it is released, if you remember, not as the title 2,000-Year-Old Man, but that first pressing is 2,000 Years with Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks. Reiner, of course, very famous. Brooks, not so much. In fact, ever since Sid Caesar had kind of, his era had come to an end, right? Brooks had really been struggling to try and find his place in life. Was he always just going to be the guy who basically wrote for Caesar? And one of the things that he had tried to do was really tried to get on Broadway. And he tried to do a lot of work. And really, I talk about this a lot in the book, that period is really a period for him of a lot of different things that don't work out. One of which, called All American, is still in Broadway's history as one of the most famous flops in the history of Broadway. Thankfully, Brooks's name never appeared on it. But really just sort of an incredible failure. And meanwhile, Brooks was still trying to work on his own projects, but things, weren't necessarily going so well. He was noodling around with things. One of the things that did go well was his second marriage to Anne Bancroft, right? But even there, I will say that at that point, when he gets married to her, his name doesn't even appear in the headlines of his own wedding announcement. It says, Anne Bancroft marries comedy writer, right? So there you go. That said, I do want to tell you about one thing he was noodling around with for a while, in this period kind of in the wilderness, that the 2,000-Year-Old Man record begins to sort of shift out. And it's about a meeting again with that guy, Kermit Bloomgarden. Now, Bloomgarden, was in conversation with Brooks, and Brooks was sort of pitching him his latest idea for a play. And this was an idea for a play that he called Springtime for Hitler. Okay. And he tells the whole thing, and he shows some early version of the script to Bloomgarden. By now they've become sort of much more friendly, right? They're on sort of more equal terms. And Bloomgarden says to him, with the perspective of a seasoned Broadway producer, he says, look, you've got 31 different scenes in here. You've got, 50 different characters. You've got these things. This is not a play. What you have here is a movie, right? And that is when the beginning of the seeds of saying, you know what, maybe time to really start thinking about shifting ambitions, not from television, not from recording, not even, from Broadway, but really we should think about a way in which sort of I should move towards the movies. And that at the very end of the beginning or the beginning of the next part is where I'm going to stop. You want more? Read the book. But we have plenty of time for questions. Thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. There's so much rich information there that people don't get. I'm going to kick off with a question that's probably very easily answerable. Not too long ago, I was in a bookstore just wandering around waiting for my daughter to finish shopping, and I ran across what it was, I guess, an autobiography of Brooks. How important was that to your work?
Well, it's funny you asked that question. So, we actually, the book came out, as you said, in 2023, but it was really supposed to come out a few months earlier. But what happened was that we discovered that, as the book was, let's say, 6 months away from publication, that Brooks had just announced that he was going to publish his own autobiography, the one that you ran across. And so we were quite well aware that if you were a fan and you were going to buy one Mel Brooks book a year, it wasn't going to be mine. So which was the correct choice, I think, for everybody. Now you should buy mine, but at that point, and so we pushed it off a bit. But what that also allowed me to do is, as you guys can imagine, is sort of look to see what Brooks said, in this memoir. Now, a memoir, as opposed to an autobiography, is about memory. And it's always interesting to sort of see what, people say, sort of remembering, as opposed to what the records say at the particular time or what people have said, 40 years ago. And Mel Brooks has given hundreds and hundreds of interviews over decades, right? And so this is interesting. So I'll just give you guys one example of this, which gets back to a wonderful story. So about Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft meeting. Okay, so they meet for the first time, and we know, right? Everybody seems to agree, and I think this is correct, that they meet for the first time when Mel Brooks comes to a theater in where Anne Bancroft is rehearsing a number that she is going to perform on the Perry Como show. Okay, so she's at the theater, she's doing her rehearsal, and Brooks comes up. He's like, "Hi, Anne, I'm Mel," and the rest is history, right? So here's the kind of question that keeps a biographer up in it. What song was she rehearsing? Okay. So I thought I knew the answer because Anne Bancroft's biographer, right? She has biographies too. Anne Bancroft's biographer, very good, has an answer. Great. Wonderful. The memoir comes out. Mel Brooks writes. He says, I went up and she was rehearsing the song, and he, of course, gives a different song. And so now I say, oh no, what am I going to do? Right? We have these these very contradictory things about this moment. So then I say, well, you know what? I wonder if I can find the episode of Perry Como in which Anne Bancroft sings. And, we have now this remarkable repository of old stuff called YouTube. And I was able to find it on YouTube. And guess what? It's a third song. So, basically, this is where, as the scholars or the writers on the call, this is where footnotes are made for, right? Where you just sort of say, well, maybe this is a quantum case. Maybe it's unknowable what the actual answer will be. But it was this kind of thing it was fun, actually, to read through Brooks's own thinking about this and say, okay, this was a lot of fun to see how he is thinking about these things in the 2020s. And how his own perspective on these events have shifted from the way he talked about them in 1975 and 1985 and 1995, which he has every right to do because it's his life and he remembers it and he's thinking about it this way. That's his job. And it's a great, again, you should buy my book first, but it's a great book and I highly recommend it.
Well, here's a question that sort of tacks on to what you said toward the very end of your talk. There are many Jewish comedians, from Jackie Mason to Jerry Seinfeld, but no one fixated on the humiliation of Hitler as did Mel. Where did that come from?
So, yeah, it's a great question. And like I said, I think that for many of the, that Brooks, in his own way, I think first was different from many of these comedians, not all, in that he actually was a combatant in World War II. He fought Nazis. He had a familial. His brother was a POW. So he had these very sort of specific hatreds of Nazis. I also think that for Brooks, he has a comedy. I mean, Mason does in his own way too, but Brooks has a comedy that is very aggressive, right? He has a very kind of aggressive energy to his comedy, and he uses that, I think, very welcomely on enemies of the Jews, particularly on anti-Semites. He really is one of our great anti-Semites, and he does so, as I had alluded to earlier, in the way that a comedian can do best, which is, he says, my job is to make these people literally ridiculous, worthy of ridicule, or more precisely, show how they are worthy of ridicule. And he does that better than I think anyone. And one of the things I always say, excuse me, about in my classes and in the book as well, right, is that you didn't have to, of course, be Jewish to hate Hitler, right, to hate Nazis. In the same way that you didn't have to be Jewish to find the producers, when it comes out, very tricky material. There were a lot of Gold Star families in America who had lost, mostly sons, but who lost children to, or fathers or brothers to Nazism, who said, I can't believe you're doing this, right? But in short, it was always very clear, I think, from the beginning, that Brooks was doing this as a way of fighting the Nazis. And I think that, that came from a real personal and biographical place, but it was something that was also widely shared in its own way through his specific comic sensibility.
Mhm. Thank you. Here's another. Was the Kaminsky family religiously observant? Number one. Number two, did Brooks ever express a wish to expand his formal education after serving in the military?
Yeah, great questions. To the best of my knowledge, the Kaminsky family was not religiously observant. Certainly, Brooks never talks about religious observance in any particular meaningful way in any of the material that he talks about. I will say that they were very, not surprised, growing up at this particular time in Brown, deeply saturated with Jewishness, right? And I think that very much comes out in Brooks's comedy. This is not a comedy in which Jewishness is sort of put on. It is sort of every part of his marrow and bone and gut and kishka and flows out kind of in that way. So I think that kind of deep Jewishness, in certain ways, Shalom Aleichem, who as I alluded to, I wrote, and maybe one of the other great Jewish comic figures of the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, he grew up religiously observant, Shalom Aleichem did, and then became not religiously observant. But Jewishness was something that he was besotted with and loved, and sort of like, you can't imagine Shalom Aleichem as being anything other than Jewish. Maybe you can imagine that with some of the others, but not some of the other Jewish comedians, not Mel Brooks. In terms of expanding his formal education, he claimed that he was interested in doing just briefly and sort of took some college courses. It's hard to know whether that actually happened. There doesn't seem to be a record of them. I think it was pretty clear to him that if he could make a living in entertainment, that was what he wanted to do. And then, as in some ways now, a college education was not really necessarily the optimal path to go in sort of pursuing that. Certainly even less than it was now.
Well, here's a question that is wide open. It could be answered in a couple of words, and in another sense, maybe for the rest of the time. You study Jewish American literature, American Jewish humor. What is an American?
Wow. Well, that is a very tough question. But I think I got a chance to look at the Q&A as well. And I think what Mr. Berger may be saying, and I'm going to answer it as if this is what he's saying, is what is all American, which is what I alluded to very quickly as one of that big flop, that big Broadway flop. So even if that's not, and I can always come back if it's not, to what is an American. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about this story, because also it's a very interesting and fun story, which has some relevance. So as I said, Brooks, and this is one of the things, again, that sort of, when you are digging in kind of the newspaper archives and what have you, you see this and you say Yahtzee, So Brooks, as I said, sort of after Caesar was basically over, right, and Brooks was looking for things to do, he tried to be on Broadway, and he tried to do these various kind of gigs, script doctoring and other kinds of things. But he had this kind of possibility, which really was just an incredible possibility that came up with some of the friends and people that did. And it was a musical based on a book that had won the Pulitzer Prize, about a Jewish emigre scientist who comes to a college and then becomes like the coach of a football team. And the team of people who did shows like Bye Bye Birdie and South Pacific and all these people, just you can imagine sort of the A-list people in every position were working together in order to make this show. It was a can't miss, surefire hit. Okay, and it was called All American. Like everything was right, and Brooks was on it to become the book writer of this. Right, he would write not the music, right, but he would write the words, right, of the show. And so this was going to be an astonishing hit, right? All American, it couldn't miss. And when I was digging in the newspaper clippings and everything like that, I found this incredibly interesting article, which said, it was interesting to me anyway, but it said this. It said, this was before the show came out, and it said, there were so many people clamoring to invest in the show that the original producers had to kind of give up some of their percentages in order to let people invest in the show, right? There was such a demand. And of course, the show was a flop, okay, for all sorts of reasons. I talk a little bit in the book, right? And so they all lost their shirts, right? All these investors, right? And you can see Mel Brooks, tearing his hair out of the possibility of his show kind of, this key to his show kind of falling apart, but also saying, it's funny, but I think it's possible that you could make more money with a flop than with a hit. If you get lots of producers baying in to invest in a show, and then you make a flop that flops on purpose, you can actually win by losing. And of course, that is the plot of The Producers. And I am actually convinced that this experience for Brooks of All American was an essential formative thing in creating the kind of backbone of the show, of The Producers. I also think that this idea of saying how you win by losing, right, is an essential part of a kind of Jewish comedy, right? One of the great Jewish comedians, Jack Benny, right, is always about sort of why I'm such a loser, right? And he turns this schnookiness, this loseriness, there's all this into huge comic success, right? And that becomes part of a story of minority humor that, again, I talk about sort of in the book. I see there's another question, which is, if you don't mind, Lee, I could just handle it. Do you know what influenced Brooks to create two of my favorite films, Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles? Now, these are two of my favorite films as well. And I'll tell you very briefly, and then if you want more details, I talk about it more. But very briefly, Brooks had made The Producers. It was it had not been a commercial success at the time. It's become a cult classic, of course. It had won an Oscar for screenplay, but it was not a big success. Still, he managed to have enough cachet to make a second film called The 12 Chairs. That was also not a commercial success. And so he really was having a lot of problems, as I say. And he's walking around, he runs into his agent, and his agent says, I have this script for you. And Brooks says, look, I produce, I only do my own stuff, basically. And the agent, with the kind of bluntness that agents can sometimes be known for, says, you're too poor to do your own stuff anymore. You should take a look at this script. And the script was the script called Tex X, as in Malcolm X, right? And it was about a guy who is black who becomes the sheriff of a Western town. And Brooks immediately gravitates to the material. Westerns were one of those genres he grows up with, that he's in love with, right? And it's also the genre where he says, there's a way in which this doesn't have room. I'm using sort of my own words, but I'm trying to articulate his ethos. It doesn't have room for people who are like me, right? This grand myth of the Western. I'm not in this. And of course, Jews aren't the only people who are not in this myth of the Western. Black people are also, except in very, very delineated ways. They're not part of this. They're certainly not the sheriffs, right? And so Brooks, who of course in Blazing Saddles appears in the movie as a Native American chief, right? Is saying, here's the way in which we can kind of parody and we can create, so we can break these kind of cliches, so to speak. And it leads to, and then I'm going to move on to Young Frankenstein as we sort of come close to the end, but it leads to this really incredible moment at the end of Blazing Saddles, this moment of genius. The whole movie has genius to it, but this moment of genius. Everybody always wants to take credit for everything in a success, right? And Blazing Saddles is a huge success. And there were multiple writers on this, right? But everyone agrees that the ending of Blazing Saddles, I'm sorry to spoil this 50-year-old movie for anyone who doesn't remember it, but is when it was revealed that the whole movie is basically artifice, right? It's basically all on this Hollywood soundstage. Everybody agrees this was Mel Brooks's ending. Okay. Nobody else takes credit for it. Everybody agrees it's Brooks. And part of the reason is it gets back to what we're saying, right? Which is all of this Western myth, all these great Westerns, they're all a lie, Brooks says. They're all really are not telling the story of what America is and could be. And that's the role of the marginalized, somewhat alienated outsider looking in. That's the Jewish role, among others, right? Is to say, I'm going to break all these cliches, right? I'm going to show you what it's really like, or that it's all really artificial, right? So that's what I'm going to say now about Blazing Saddles, excuse me. Plenty else to say, and there's some in the book. While he is shooting Blazing Saddles, right, he originally does not cast actually either of the two leads for different reasons, but he was really beginning to shoot with the Gene Wilder role being played by someone else, Western actor Gig Young, but who becomes ill. He's an alcoholic. He becomes ill because of his alcoholism. He can't participate, and Gene Wilder comes on to take on the role. And so during the shooting of Blazing Saddles, Wilder actually comes to Brooks and says, look, I know we're both huge fans of this other genre, right? The universal horror movies. And we should do a parody of those. But Wilder says, I want to play this one much straighter than the Blazing Saddles is turning out to be, right? For one thing, he says to Brooks, I don't want you in it. That's like kind of winking to the audience that I don't want. And the other thing, is that we really want to make this in some ways as authentic as possible. They go back, they find a lot of the original sets, right? The Universal sets. And it's interesting, and this is where I'll close. Lee very kindly sort of mentioned my next book, which is actually coming out just in time for Halloween, this History of American Horror. So if you like the Mel Brooks book, you want to buy another one, and you like spooky stuff, it's there. And I watched many of these movies, these Universal horror movies, after I had done the Mel Brooks book. I watched the main ones for the Mel Brooks book, but I hadn't watched all the sequels of the Universal. And I was amazed that many of the things that I thought were so insane that, of course, they were Mel Brooks parodies, actually appear in all of these old Universal horror movies. So, sometimes comedy is just playing straight what might have happened before and just letting the audience sort of saturate in the absurdity of it. That said, and this will be my last thing because we're already a little over time. That said, it's very clear to me, and I make this argument, which may seem counterintuitive, that despite being played straight, Young Frankenstein is the most Jewish of all of Mel Brooks's movies, at least on a thematic level, because what it really is a movie about accepting your own identity, right? It's a movie where a man who insists that his name is Frankenstein, right, goes back to his old country and becomes, right, embraces his original name, embraces his original heritage, right? It may be a little unruly, a little chaotic, right? But some people may even find it monstrous, but it gives you sort of the real joy, the real satisfaction, the real personality. If there is nobody who is a major figure in American Jewish culture who is so joyous and so full of that kind of embrace of Jewishness in that way as Mel Brooks. And so thank you, Mel, right? And so with that, I'll stop. Thank you all very much.
Well, just one thing further. This will be a very brief answer, I think. Looking at your record, I pointed out you're very prolific with every 5 years, a couple of books. But last year we had a book, this year we have a book. Does that mean there's one next year? We're going to go back to the regular schedule. What is that book going to be?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I actually am finishing up a history of Yiddish literature for Princeton University Press. So I think that might be the next one that comes after this. So we'll see when that comes out. I'm hoping 25, and so then I'll keep my streak going.
Write it down. Mark your shopping lists. Well,
Thank you so much, all of you.
thank you, Jeremy, for a wonderful talk. So enlightening to learn about this unbelievably funny comic and what's behind it. Quite profound, actually. As I said to begin, this is the last of our sessions this year. Richard Hecht and I are already looking into speakers for next year. So we'll be in touch in the course of the late summer or early fall with what's going to happen next year in the Taubman Symposia. Thanks for your participation this year. We hope to see you again next year and count on your continued financial support. Thank you very much and good afternoon. Bye, Jeremy.
Bye. Thank you all. Bye-bye.